China was, until recently, the world's greatest economic success story. In just a few decades, it transformed itself from a poor agrarian society into a global manufacturing powerhouse. Cities rose from the ground at incredible speed. New infrastructure expanded rapidly across the country, and the economy seemed unstoppable. Many believed it was only a matter of time before China overtook the United States as the world's largest economy. But that outcome now looks uncertain. Growth is slowing, youth unemployment is rising, and confidence, both at home and abroad, is starting to falter. So what happened? Why is China's economy now struggling? What can the government do to fix it? And the rumors that China is heading toward its own version of Japan's lost decades, are they true? Let's start by taking a look at how we got here. For decades, China's economic growth was fueled by an extraordinary investment boom. Cities expanded at an unprecedented rate. High-speed rail networks stretched across the country, and the property market became a vast engine of growth. This model, however, is no longer delivering the same results. Growth has slowed, with GDP expanding by 5% in 2024. Impressive compared to Western economies, but weak by China's historical standards, and not enough to create jobs for China's growing number of unemployed and increasingly disgruntled young people. The demand-driven growth that many economists expected to emerge as an alternative has yet to materialize, as cautious households save instead of spend. One of the major factors holding back consumer spending is the insecurity surrounding China's social security and pension system. Many workers, particularly in the private sector and among the rural population, lack adequate pension coverage, forcing them to save aggressively for old age. The government's pension system is under strain due to an aging population and a shrinking workforce, with deficits in some local pension funds already becoming apparent. Without stronger social safety nets, including improved healthcare and retirement benefits, Chinese households will continue to prioritize saving over consumption, further stifling economic growth. Unless Beijing takes significant steps to reform its welfare system and provide greater financial security for its citizens, the transition to a consumption-driven economy will remain elusive. Another major factor weighing on consumer confidence is the collapse of the property sector, which has wiped out about $18 trillion in household wealth, an economic shock that exceeds the 2008 US housing crisis. For decades, Chinese households saw real estate as the safest and most reliable store of wealth, given the country's lack of alternative investment options. The stock market was seen as too risky. It was highly volatile with frequent regulatory crackdowns, while strict capital controls made it difficult for ordinary savers to invest overseas. As a result, property became the primary vehicle for Chinese household savings, with families often pooling resources across generations to buy apartments. This led to an unprecedented real estate boom, with overbuilding, speculative purchases, and inflated valuations, creating a bubble that has now burst. With property values plummeting, many Chinese consumers, having saved their earnings at much greater levels than their Western counterparts, have seen their financial security significantly depleted, if not wiped out. This has only deepened their sense of economic insecurity, prompting them to cut back on spending and further increase savings out of fear for the future. As a result, domestic demand weakens even further, making it even more difficult for China to transition to a consumption-driven economy. And then there is China's dysfunctional fiscal model. While Beijing holds tightly to its control over national finances, most spending responsibilities fall on local governments, which are now struggling under the weight of crippling debts. These regional governments, responsible for providing education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social services, have long relied on land sales and off-the-books borrowing to make ends meet. With the collapse of the property market, their primary revenue source has dried up, leaving them desperate for funds. In an effort to balance the books, many local officials have turned to arbitrary taxation, fines, and regulatory crackdowns on businesses, further dampening private sector confidence. So what is the central government's strategy? Well, in response to the downturn, Beijing has gradually shifted towards stimulus measures, but these have been piecemeal and largely ineffective. The government has provided liquidity to the financial sector, recapitalized banks, and eased borrowing conditions for local governments. But these efforts have failed to reignite strong economic activity. The focus remains on targeted interventions, rather than the large-scale fiscal stimulus that many analysts argue is necessary. Instead, Beijing continues to prioritize investment in infrastructure and manufacturing, reinforcing the very model that is now failing. The leadership's reluctance to embrace policies that would empower consumers reflects deep-seated ideological preferences that favor production and state-led growth over individual consumption. One of the most striking aspects of China's current economic strategy is its aggressive push for technological self-sufficiency. Xi Jinping's government has poured hundreds of billions into sectors such as semiconductors, electric vehicles, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence, hoping to reduce reliance on foreign technology and establish dominance in high-value industries. The strategy has produced some successes. China now leads the world in electric vehicle production, and companies like Huawei have made notable advances in chip design despite Western sanctions. However, the costs of this approach are immense. Many industries are suffering from massive overcapacity, leading to collapsing prices and squeezed profit margins. In the solar sector, Chinese firms have engaged in price wars that have driven polysilicon prices down by nearly 60%. And the electric vehicle industry, buoyed by government subsidies, has seen production capacity far outstrip domestic demand, leading to a surge in exports that is now drawing scrutiny from foreign governments. In short, the plan is failing, and there clearly needs to be a course correction. So to sum it all up, China's current strategy, dumping excess capacity onto global markets while aggressively climbing the value chain, is increasingly unsustainable. The world is pushing back. A new wave of trade tensions, tariffs, and restrictions from the US, EU, and other major economies is making it harder for China to rely on exports as an economic safety valve. Meaning without significant adjustments, Beijing risks not only continued economic stagnation, but also worsening international trade conflicts. I'm not trying to say that China shouldn't prioritize high-tech and higher value-added manufacturing, but its approach needs to be more measured and balanced. A sustainable path forward requires strengthening domestic demand, something the Chinese government has promised for years but failed to meaningfully deliver. One of the key obstacles to boosting domestic demand is the lack of a reliable safety net, which forces households to save excessively. Without confidence in their financial future, people are reluctant to spend. Expanding and reforming China's pension system, alongside improvements in healthcare and social security, would provide much-needed stability. If citizens knew they could rely on these systems, they would be far more likely to direct their income toward consumption rather than hoarding savings for an uncertain future. Regarding the collapse of the property sector, a comprehensive bailout or restructuring plan for unfinished and failing housing projects is essential. Without massive intervention, the sector, and the losses dwelling within it, will continue to act as a drag on economic growth, preventing a meaningful recovery in consumer confidence. And beyond the housing crisis, the financial structure of local governments is also in dire need of reform. A more sustainable fiscal system, one that incorporates fairer taxation and direct fiscal transfers from Beijing, would provide much-needed stability to local economies and reduce the reliance on short-term, growth-damaging measures. However, if the state did take meaningful measures to address these, a rebalanced economy, driven by stronger domestic demand, would not only reduce China's dependence on exports, but also lessen global trade tensions. Instead of flooding the world with excess industrial output, China could cultivate its own internal growth engine, fostering sustainable economic expansion and increasing demand for imports. Beijing still has the tools to steer the economy in the right direction. The question is whether it has the political will to change direction and embrace real reform before stagnation gets a foothold and becomes permanent. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like, subscribe, and follow. Thanks for watching.